So every 500 years, the church cleans out its attic and has a giant garage sale. Well, not exactly, but according to Phyllis Tickle, a renowned sociologist of religion, this is a good summary of the church's history. According to Tickle's incisive look, Christianity has throughout its history been shaped by reoccurring 500-year cycles of structural and spiritual dissolution, turmoil, and reformation. She identifies 4 past rotations of this cycle. So for Western Christianity, the Reformation was about 500 years ago. 500 years before that, you hit the Great Schism when the church divided between East and West. 500 years earlier, you have Pope Gregory the Great, who helped bring the church out of the Dark Ages. And finally, 500 years earlier, in the 1st century, you have the birth of Christianity and the church, the Apostolic Church. So if history is a fair predictor of what's coming, and it almost always is, we are at a turning point. The Reformation happened exactly 507 years ago. So we appear to be in the midst of another period of significant turmoil and rebirth. We're in the eye of the storm, a moment in history of great opportunity and challenge. I believe that in this period, the contribution of the Global South Church will be very significant, perhaps more than ever before. In her analysis, Tickle did not take this seriously enough, but the demographic of the church is changing. It continues to shift from the global north, Europe, North America, to the global south, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Christianity in the global south is growing at a phenomenal pace in comparison to global north Christianity. Now the question is, what will global south Christianity bring to the history of the global church? What new insights will the church gain? What will change? What needs to be remembered? Who gets to decide? I am excited to see the role of this community, INFEMIT, will play in this time of great shift. So, as part of this process of discernment, allow me to focus on one aspect of the Christian theological imagination that needs a critical second look, that needs desperately the perspective of the global south, an analysis of Christianity not from Chicago, London, or Moscow, but from Ramallah, Manila, and Cochabamba. I would like us to focus on how the Christian theological imagination of the West was and still is influenced by colonial dominance. So I will illustrate this statement with 2 examples. First, I will expound and critique colonial soteriology used to justify the colonization of Africa and the Americas. And secondly, we will talk about colonial eschatology used to legitimize the colonization of Palestine. So let us start with colonial soteriology. In the colonial moment, what gave colonial powers a higher right to dispose of people as they saw fit was the doctrine of salvation, soteriology. In 1444, Gomes de Anes de Azurara was the official royal chronicle of Portugal. He was commissioned to narrate and interpret the Portuguese trafficking of sub-Saharan African slaves. In his book, The Chronicle of the Discovery of the Conquest of Guinea, Zurara narrates how Portugal enters African soil and captures slaves. However, in the middle of his narrative, he tells us he begins to cry. And more interestingly, he quickly repents for those tears. Allow me to read an excerpt of the passage I am referring to. Quote, "On the next day, which was the 8th of the month of August, very early in the morning, by reason of the heat, the seamen began to make ready their boats, and to take out those captives and carry them on shore as they were commanded. And these placed together in that field were a marvelous sight. But what heart could be so hard as not to be pierced with piteous feeling to see that company? For some kept their heads low and their faces bathed in tears, looking one upon another. Others stood groaning very dolorously, looking up to the height of heaven, fixing their eyes upon it, crying loudly, as if asking help of the Father of nature. Others struck their faces upon the ground, and though we could not understand the words of their language, the sound of it right well accord with the measure of their sadness. I pray thee that my tears may not wrong my conscience, for it is not their religion, but their humanity that makes me weep in pity for their suffering, unquote. But he spends little time mourning about the tragedy that he was witnessing. Let me read the next part. Quote, "The Infante was there, for he reflected with great pleasure upon the salvation of those souls that before were lost. And certainly his expectation was not in vain, for as we said before, as soon as they understood our language, they turned Christians with very little ado. And I, who put together this history into this volume, saw in the town of Lagos boys and girls, the children and grandchildren of those first captives, as good and true Christians as if they had directly descended from the beginnings of the dispensation of Christ for those who were baptized," unquote. You see, Sara must reconcile the viciousness of slavery with his Christian faith, and while doing so, he weeps. However, he repents for his tears as he legitimizes slavery as the means ordained by God for African conversion. In doing so, Sara initiates a theological tradition where the Church will use divine providence and soteriology to theologically condone Western powers over the New World. Here we see how his theology functions as a wall that prohibits him to empathize with the other. It is, as Jennings aptly puts it, soteria, salvation without koinonia, without fellowship. Meaning, here Sara will begin a theological tradition where Christians look for the salvation of the world without the biblical fellowship that comes with it. In his book, The Christian Imagination, Jennings explains it well. Quote, "Sara deploys a theoretical strategy of containment, holding slave suffering inside a Christian story that will be recycled by countless theologians and intellectuals of every colonialist nation. The telos and the denouncement of the event will be enacted as an order of salvation, an ordo salutis. African captivity leads to African salvation," unquote. Now, let us move to examine colonial eschatology, something I have been working on for my PhD. So, contrary to popular belief, this older form of European settler colonialism did not end. Although settler colonialism morphed and perhaps became more complex, it is still alive and well in Palestine and with no shortage of theological justification. Allow me to give you one example. One motif in Christian Zionism is to present the creation of the State of Israel as a miracle of God. It is even used as an apologetical tool to prove God's existence. To many Christians today, 1948 is the year of a realized dream, a Jewish state. The creation of the State of Israel fulfills biblical prophecy and therefore is seen as a miracle of God. But just as the colonizers silenced slave suffering with the excuse of salvation, this interpretation also serves as a tool for silencing Palestinian suffering. For Palestinians, this miracle is plainly called the Nakba, the catastrophe. The creation of the Jewish state meant the expulsion of another nation. In 1948, over 750,000 Palestinians lost their homes, never to return. To establish the Jewish state, Zionist forces depopulated and destroyed more than 500 Palestinian towns and villages and committed no less than 24 massacres against the Palestinian people. You can read more about the Nakba in this book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, written by an Israeli historian, Ian Pape. But we are never told about Al-Nakba, the catastrophe, in our church congregations. I personally never heard about it until I married a Palestinian and moved to Bethlehem in 2016. We are told to pray for Israel, but we are never encouraged to pray for Palestine. The suffering of the Palestinian people is often silenced under the banner of prophecy and biblical fulfillment. As evangelical Christians from the global south, influenced a lot by American missionaries, we have only heard one story, one side of the story. In critical race theory, these one-sided historical accounts are called stock stories. Stock stories are the stories that make up the collective consciousness of any dominant group. A stock story is therefore a collection of perceptions that provide the dominant group with a shared interpreted network to view reality. As Latina CRT scholar Aja Martinez explains, quote, "Stock stories are powerful because they are often repeated until canonized or normalized. And those who tell them insist that their version of the events is indeed reality, and that any stories that counter these standardized tellings are biased and therefore not credible," unquote. So to counter, to oppose hegemonic narratives, critical race theory uses counter stories. As a methodological tool, counter story presents a contrasting description of hegemonic narratives. A counter story is meant to recount the experiences and perspectives of racially and socially marginalized people, and by doing so, disrupt the hegemony of stock stories. So to counter the stock story of the creation of Israel as a miracle of God, let me offer you a counter story, the story of my husband's family. One of the families that escaped the Zionist forces in 1948 was the family of Tony's grandfather, Najib Elias. He lived with his parents and 3 siblings in a village in Galilee called Shefamer. In 1948, they left their home in great haste and fear, most probably in the same day of the invasion, taking only the keys of their house, documents of ownership, and a few pieces of jewelry that Tony's great-grandma Basma owned. They escaped to Bethlehem, where they lived as refugees for the first several years. They stayed in small garages from local Bethlehemites, and they were receiving help from the Dominican nuns. Years later, in 1968, Tony's mom, Rita, tells the story that when she was 8 years old, her father took her back to Galilee, to Shefamer, to see the house he grew up in. But when they knocked on the door, a Jewish family met them. The Jewish family was now the occupier of their home, and they were never allowed to return. Tony's grandpa had another sister. Her name was Jalile, who lived with her husband and children in Akka. Jalile sadly did not survive El Nakba. She was killed in 1948 when the Zionist forces poisoned the water supplies of Akka in preparation for their invasion of the city. The name of this operation is well documented, was Cast Thy Bread, which is a misuse of Ecclesiastes 11:1. How do humans legitimize killing others, slaving others, disposing of others? To justify oppression, colonialism firstly silences the other, and then it does whatever it can to dehumanize the other. Sadly, Christianity in the Western world has done this by creating a theological other, the Muslim other, the indigenous other, the sinful other, and then creating theological wildcards that excuse any behavior in favor of a higher Christian telos. It doesn't matter that we are taking people's lands, livelihood, freedom, we are making them Christians. It doesn't matter that Palestinians are being killed, that they are being expelled from their homes, and that they are being denied basic human rights. This is all necessary for the fulfillment of end times prophecy. Colonial Christian imagination biblically justifies the oppression of others. It's 2024 and the Nakba continues. In total disbelief and pain, we have watched how Israel has destroyed all hospitals in Gaza, how it has blown up all universities, how it has created a situation of starvation. We do not know how to properly mourn the death of at least 15,000 Palestinian Christians. We joined the marches for a ceasefire in London, not only for political activism, but for our mental health. Those huge marches reminds us that we are not alone, that the world has not lost all its moral compass. But as we observe those who joined these marches, Christians are by no means the biggest crowds. We meet a lot of Jewish brothers and sisters who want to dissociate Zionism from Judaism. We meet Muslims from all nationalities working tirelessly with creative nonviolent resistance. We meet secular environmental activists and people concerned with human rights and children's safety. We are encouraged by the prophetic role of organizations such as UNICEF, Save the Children, Amnesty International. But we don't meet many Christians. I suspect Christians are still paralyzed and confused by prophecies they have been told at church. They are still numbed by cultural stereotypes about Palestinians and Muslims. I suspect their eschatology normalized wars in the Middle East as something planned by God for the eschaton. What's the point of marching against God's will? But Christians not only remain silent, some also actively support this war. Here's a picture of Mike Pence, former US Vice President and committed evangelical Christian, someone who used to organize Bible studies in the White House. Here he is signing Israeli missiles meant to hit Gaza. This is another picture from a Christian conference called the Golan Heights Legacy Festival. In this conference, Christians are invited to pray and stand in solidarity with Israel at the Golan Heights. They get together in an IDF military camp. So they pray on top of Israeli war machines. As if the good news of the gospel has anything to do with this, or this. Where is Jesus, his example and teachings in all of this? Have we taken Jesus out of our Christian imagination? As Palestinian pastor Munder Isaac puts it, quote, "The irony for us Palestinian Christians is that evangelicals, with their overemphasis on prophecy, have lost the capacity of being prophetic. You want to prove that the Bible is right? You don't do this by pointing to world events as prophecy fulfillment. This is not how you prove that the Bible is right. We prove that the Bible is right by radical obedience to the teachings of Jesus, by proving that Jesus' teachings actually work and that they can make the world a better place. Let us love our enemies, forgive those who sin against us, walk the extra mile, be inclusive, not exclusive, turn the other cheek, and maybe, and only maybe then, the world will start to take us seriously and believing in our Bible." Unquote. As I was preparing for this talk, I found this meme that cleverly articulates what I wanted to say. There is no version of Jesus that would say, "You know, now that you explained it, I'm okay with this war. Forget what I've already said. Do take revenge. You're right. The whole forgive 7 times 7 is unrealistic. Do unto others whatever you want. He who lives by the sword wins." And so I circle back to the beginning of my presentation. We are at a time in history where the church is going through a massive cleanup, in which the church rids itself of what it's no longer needed and rediscovers treasures it had forgotten. I believe the Palestinian church is helping us remember what is truly essential. Despite the Bible being weaponized against them, they still hold on to its teaching. In the darkness moments, they have not lost faith. In a region of war and hatred, they have chosen the hard path of nonviolent resistance. Most importantly, they are reminding us that Jesus is at the center of our faith, his teachings and example. So as Mitri Rahev says, quote, "I believe that diamonds are made under pressure. There is so much pressure now in Palestine, but there are so many diamonds." Thank you.